The United States is often called a Christian country. The nation, however, has always been home to individuals indifferent to, or opposed to, organized religions. These unbelievers were known as agnostics, atheists, deists, infidels, liberals, and freethinkers.
Blasphemy laws were on the books in numberless cities across the United States. They weren't used terribly often. A blasphemy prosecution was a fairly rare thing, but the threat was always there. And that threat was often used to put limits on what freethinkers could say or how they could say it.
Long after Thomas Paine's death in 1809, his book, The Age of Reason, remained widely read and influential, and it continued to be attacked. A Massachusetts newspaper editor complained,
"Thomas Paine, that infidel in religion, seduces many of you, my countrymen. You read his Age of Reason and think the Bible a last year's almanac."
A frustrated Christian missionary in Wisconsin lamented the extent of irreligion.
This has always been a stronghold of infidelity from its first settlement, and a large share of the influence is still on that side of the question.
The missionary condemned what he viewed as the cause.
Paine's Age of Reason is read with avidity in many families, and its doctrines are boldly and strenuously advocated by men of influence. Not a few mothers drink in this poison.
In 1829, a gentleman traveling through Louisiana and Mississippi was shocked by what he allegedly saw.
Atheism, loud, shameless, and bitterly persecuting. Infidelity, fashionable, gloried in and triumphing over the weakness, helplessness, and absurding of Christianity.
Clergymen continued their crusade against Thomas Paine and infidelity. Attacks on Paine poured down from the pulpit. After hearing a typical Sunday sermon condemning the revolutionary author-hero, a fair-minded Christian editor of a New Orleans newspaper wrote in disgust,
"It would appear from pulpit declamations on infidelity that Paine had done nothing in his whole life but curse God and drink brandy. And such was the picture drawn that I imagined a man with a bottle nose and bloated face full of carbuncles and named Tom Paine. I am no infidel. I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. I venerate and respect the clergy, but I love a patriot more."
Although Thomas Paine and freethinkers were often called atheists and infidels, according to Freethought publisher Gilbert Vail, the majority of freethinkers were not atheists. Vail wrote extensively on the opinions of the subscribers to his Beacon periodical and summarized the belief system of his fellow freethinkers.
Among free inquirers, the being of a God is an open question. Many believe, some disbelieve, and many more are in doubt. Gilbert Vail.
In the late 18th century, Thomas Paine assailed slavery and organized religions from the outside. A half-century later, some Christians began raising objections from within their own churches.
Come-outerism was the practice among abolitionists of leaving churches that did not condemn slavery. Abolitionists would go to their ministers, they would try and make anti-slavery announcements from either the pews or from the pulpit, and when they were rejected, they would protest and they would leave the church, complaining that the church did not sufficiently condemn slavery as a sin. And so many abolitionists came out of their churches.
While some abolitionists, like Elijah Wright, left their churches in protest, Lucretia Mott decided not to come out, but to stay in and challenge her fellow Quakers on the issue of slavery.
She decided it would be more effective if she remained in the Society of Friends and agitated as a member of the organization. She called it standing out in heresy. She had to be willing to take the criticism, the accusations from her fellow Quakers in order to change the organization.
My conviction led me to adhere to the sufficiency of the light within us, resting on truth for authority, not on authority for truth. Lucretia Mott.
Like her fellow Quaker Thomas Paine, Lucretia Mott believed in the light within and principled heresy. And in much the same way that Paine had inspired freethinkers to unite, Mott would become instrumental in launching the women's rights movement.
In 1840, Lucretia Mott went to the World's Anti-Slavery Convention. She was an official delegate representing the American Anti-Slavery Society and the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, among other organizations. When she arrived at the convention, the London committee that had organized the convention did not allow her or the other official American female delegates to participate in the convention. They could sit and observe, but they were not official delegates.
As a protest to the organizers' decision to exclude female delegates, abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison sat with the women.
One of the commemorations of the convention was a painting by Robert Hayden. So she and her husband both sat for Robert Hayden in his studio. And before they left London, they returned to his studio to see the painting. And she discovered, of course, that she was not prominently featured in it, despite having sat for the artist. James Mott is clearly visible in the foreground. Lucretia Mott is a blurry image in the background. And Robert Hayden, in his diary, recorded that he had determined he was not going to include Lucretia Mott because he was saving a prominent spot for a beautiful believer in the divinity of Christ. And he had determined that Lucretia Mott was not such a believer.
Lucretia Mott leads the American women, has infidel notions, so I do not give her the prominence I intended. That goes to a devout believer, Benjamin Robert Hayden.
At the convention, Lucretia Mott met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the young wife of abolitionist Henry Brewster Stanton. After the London Committee voted to exclude female delegates, the two women agreed that when they returned to America, they would organize a women's rights convention.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton viewed the Bible as not the Word of God, as a historical document, and thus not particularly useful for making rules about women's behavior or women's rights. She viewed the Bible as, for the most part, being used to harm women and keep women down rather than to lift them up.
Many of the men and women who worked to end slavery joined the women's movement. In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were the two main organizers of the first Women's Rights Assembly held in Seneca Falls, New York. Along with Mott and others, Stanton wrote the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. Modeled after the Declaration of Independence, the controversial document denounced discrimination against women, including religious injustice. During a period when women were forbidden to give speeches in public, Stanton assailed the clergy, a theme she would continue to express the rest of her life.
The Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Stanton's anti-clerical remarks, as well as the convention itself, evoked the wrath of clergymen and the press. Clerics and conservative newspapers denounced the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments as atheistic. James Gordon Bennett, publisher of the New York Herald, the most popular newspaper in America, characterized the Women's Rights Assembly as a combination of socialism, abolitionism, and infidelity.
I think he once called Lucretia Mott basically a grizzled Caesar. He regularly accused abolitionists and women's rights activists of insanity, infidelity, breaking with accepted religious traditions, socialism, any epithet that he could throw at them, he would throw at them.
The Seneca Falls Convention was one of 3 major public events in the span of just 6 years that critics perceived as threatening organized religion. The very first occurred a few months earlier in Boston and was also attended by Garrisonian abolitionists.
The Anti-Sabbath Convention was held in March 1848, and it was a meeting organized to protest efforts to enshrine into law the Sabbath as a holy day of observance.
The Protestant fanatics weren't satisfied even with the limits they had. I mean, they wanted to cancel all mail service on the Sundays. They wanted ships and transportation to stop. So this was a constant struggle to push back against this very well-organized force.
Mott was particularly critical of Sabbatarian efforts because she viewed them as superstitious, and she also viewed them as a violation of individual liberties and an individual right to pursue one's own conscience and personal beliefs. And so, for example, she was much more interested in people observing every day as a holy day and doing good and living a religious life every day rather than having it be mandated on a specific day.
The third event critical of religion, the Hartford Bible Convention, was held a few years later in 1854.
Was in a tradition of speaking out about religion and attempts to use religion to force people to conform to particular worldviews and to legislate, basically, morality and belief in American society.
The 4-day Connecticut meeting was called to order by the leading proponent of spiritualism in America, Andrew Jackson Davis.
The earliest spiritualists thought of themselves as scientists, and they thought that through their seances, they were finding a new way to prove what the afterlife was really like. And it wasn't like the Bible said it was. So that put them in a position of enmity relative to Christianity.
Communicating with spirits acted as a surrogate religion for many fearful of the vast changes in American life. Spiritualists had no need for dogma or ministers in their communications with the deceased and unseen. Their creed eliminated the middleman, the clergy.
It was a very interesting relationship between the Freethinkers and the spiritualists. A lot of people saw them as being in one big camp. And certainly what they had in common was they both dared to question Christian orthodoxy and the traditional Christian view of heaven and hell and all of these sorts of things. There was a lot of interchange between the movements. So you see figures like Matilda Joslyn Gage, who was a very important figure in the women's rights movement, an outspoken freethinker, and also involved in spiritualism. And there was a certain amount of friendship, feeling of people involved in a common effort between the spiritualists and the freethinkers.
Lucretia Mott was skeptical of spiritualism. She certainly had friends and allies who participated in seances. Her husband, James Mott, who was also an abolitionist, participated in a seance. But she was, above all, a rationalist. She believed in argumentation. She believed that Americans and all human beings should move away from superstition and towards science.
The Hartford Bible Convention was attended by a diverse group of prominent reformers, including abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison, Parker Pillsbury, and Ernestine Rose, a firebrand atheist. Rose's speech caused pandemonium and created a huge sensation throughout conservative Orthodox New England.
Her speeches were protested far more than other participants, not only because she was a self-proclaimed atheist, but because she was a woman. So the idea that a woman would speak publicly and say that the Bible is simply a historical document, it might have some useful observations of us on how to live, but it shouldn't be a law, was just scandalous to people.
My sisters, the Bible has enslaved you. The churches have been built on your subjugated necks. Do you wish to be free? Then you must trample the Bible, the church, and the priest under your feet. Ernestine Rose.
And she did cause some controversy because of her professed atheism. Some people in the women's rights movement especially felt uncomfortable with that. And in the anti-slavery movement as well. Probably at many anti-slavery conventions, there would be a debate over, are we going to start this meeting with a prayer? And Lucretia Mott, to her credit, would always say, no, we should not start this meeting with a prayer. We should not start it with a hymn. We should not start it with a song. That this is, imposing a particular worldview and explanation on others.
If our principles are right, why should we be cowards?
In their opposition to slavery, the reformers at Hartford united in their distrust of religious institutions. In his speech at Hartford, Parker Pillsbury, who would later publish The Revolution with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, stated their resolution to condemn any Bible, religion, church, or ministry that defended or apologized for slavery, war, or oppressive government. Pillsbury's speech expressed the strong abolitionist sentiment occurring at the time both outside and inside of churches. In the early to mid-19th century, frontier religionists often expressed concern about the prevalence of skepticism and denounced infidels who had the audacity to reside in what they regarded as God's country. An Indiana minister complained in the Home Missionary periodical.
Infidelity prevails to an alarming extent. There are in this village more than 100 families. Out of that number, there are more than 40 men, heads of families, who openly deny their belief in the Holy Scriptures. Among them are the wealthiest and most influential men in the place.
In the early to middle years of the 19th century, organized freethought activity was confined mainly to New York City. Free-thinking editors, however, and there were only a few in the nation, often expressed their optimism that their fight was gaining strides to vanquish religious superstitions across the land. One editor reported,
"The glorious free principles are slowly yet surely and steadily progressing. Truth, though sometimes tardy in her progress, is sure to triumph in the end. Priestly influences is still felt here, but it has less effect than formerly upon the minds of the people. Science and knowledge are doing a great work here. It is fast overturning the old theories founded on tradition and superstition. A few years ago, an individual as a skeptic was scarcely known in this section of the country, but now their number is quite respectable."
One skeptic was D.M. Bennett, a former prominent member of the Communalistic United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, or Shakers as they were commonly known. In 1850, a few years after Bennett and his wife Mary left the celibate Shaker Society, Bennett visited Beacon publisher Gilbert Vale in New York and purchased Freethought literature, including Paine's The Age of Reason. A few years later, while living in Cincinnati, Bennett attended lectures on Thomas Paine by anti-slavery speaker Moncure Conway, an influential minister turned freethinker. Conway was a forceful defender of Cincinnati's Jewish population, who saw parallels between the prejudice against Jews and the way Christians had vilified Thomas Paine. After investigating Paine's important role in the American Revolution, Conway had become an ardent Paine promoter and early biographer. Thomas Paine's cogent argument against revealed religion in the Age of Reason and Conway's lectures transformed Bennett from a devout Christian who prayed twice daily and at meals into a freethinker who was convinced Christianity was the greatest sham in the world. In early 19th century America, infidel newspapers began to appear to counteract the ubiquitous Christian press. Taking a cue from the astute Christian-sponsored American Tract Society, freethinkers utilized similar tactics against Christianity. Unlike Christian publishers, however, who had the immeasurable financial support of untaxed church coffers, Freethought publishers were dependent on and at the mercy of paid subscribers.
Basically, the invention of the steam press made it possible to mass produce pamphlets and booklets on a vast scale. It still took a lot of money. You needed to be able to make very large investments in order to do this, and the freethinkers usually didn't have that kind of money. Christian conservatives generally did.
Throughout the 19th century, anyone publishing material that challenged or opposed religion faced social and possible legal hazards, and anyone who publicly questioned religion or criticized in print the powerful Christian institutions or their influential leaders was regarded as an enemy of God, a blasphemer.
It's interesting that in the 19th century, the First Amendment was really seen as protecting the states from the federal government. Only later did it receive the interpretation that we now have of it as protecting the right of free expression.
Laws against blasphemy were introduced in the American colonies in the early 17th century. In Massachusetts, Quakers, both men and women, were stripped and flogged for their anti-Christian religion. 4 Quakers, including Mary Dyer, in 1660, were hanged for their blasphemy. After the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788 and the First Amendment was adopted in 1791, most state constitutions prohibited the establishment of an official religion. Some states, however, Massachusetts in particular, continued to pass laws and prosecute persons for speaking evil of sacred Christian matters. In the 19th century, the first freethinker imprisoned for blasphemy was Abner Kneeland, a former Baptist and Universalist minister.
Kneeland founded the Boston Investigator, which was basically one of the 3 top Freethought publications. The Index, the Boston Investigator, and of course Bennett's Truth Seeker were the movement's journals of record.
Abner Kneeland still believed in God, but not the Universalists' version of God. Political enemies called the former minister the Apostle of Satan, and his periodical a lavastream of blasphemy and obscenity. In 1834, he was indicted on 3 counts of blasphemy.
What brought out a blasphemy prosecution, what motivated the authorities to act, and one of the relatively rare times that they brought a blasphemy case to trial, was not heresy. It was not hair-splitting over some religious conundrum and saying, oh, you know, so many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It was challenging the religious enterprise itself.
In the pages of the Boston Investigator, Abner Kneeland characterized the Bible as a pack of lies and the clergy as hypocrites.
Kneeland came out as a freethinker and called religion socially harmful. He called the church an evil thing, and that, I think, is what motivated his being singled out.
After 4 trials and a conviction, Abner Kneeland's case was heard in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Kneeland represented himself in front of Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw, considered by some as the greatest magistrate in American history. An experienced public speaker and well-informed on legal matters, Neelan proved himself a worthy opponent. Shaw, however, the son of a minister, upheld the editor's conviction and delivered the opinion on blasphemy. Despite public outcry and a petition campaign, which increased the Boston Investigator's circulation, Abner Neelan served 2 months in jail. In the years preceding the Civil War, Freethinkers began to organize, and in 1857, the Infidel Association of the United States held a convention in Philadelphia. The meeting hall was decorated with banners quoting the Treaty of Tripoli and Thomas Paine's Principle of Faith.
In the mid-19th century, the Freethinkers generally called themselves infidels. There was even an infidels convention. As time went on, more and more popular opprobrium got attached to that infidel name. And then you get into the 1870s, and they've started to call themselves liberals.
By the mid-19th century, geological discoveries and other scientific evidence had done much to refute Christian claims that the Bible was of divine origin. Within a few years, Freethinkers had another weapon in their quiver: Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species. Published on the eve of the Civil War, On the Origin of Species undermined the Bible's account of creation.
Before Darwin, it was widely believed that human beings were different in kind rather than in degree from the rest of creation. This was a Christian argument, that only human beings had souls and that animals did not, and that human beings represented a special creation. Darwin says that's wrong. Darwin says human beings are only different in degree from the rest of creation, and particularly different only in degree from the other primates. And that seems to rob human beings of their special place in the universe.
As Copernicus, Galileo, and Giordano Bruno had done centuries earlier, Charles Darwin demonstrated once again that human beings were not as central in the scheme of creation as most had believed.
And one of the reasons that Galileo and others got into trouble with the church is because they are saying that the earth is not this special place. It's not in the center of everything. And Darwin completes that argument by saying even on the earth, human beings are not in the center of creation. And that was very troubling to a lot of people.
Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species stunned conventional society and was condemned as blasphemous by religious conservatives. Nearly every clergyman denounced the book, Charles Darwin, and the atheistic evolutionists who promoted it.
Christianity has repeatedly set itself against new advances in science, in political understanding. Religion has tended, more often than not, to be an extremely conservative force.
The major discussions and impact of On the Origin of Species would, however, have to wait a few years. After the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, public debate regarding the religious and scientific implications of Darwin's theories were, for the most part, suspended. Despite all the enlightening scientific developments of the mid-19th century, the Christian crusade continued. In New York City, the American Tract Society flourished.
They would employ what they called colporteurs. These were guys who would ride around the country, particularly the areas out west, on horseback, and sell little, give away Bibles, sell little religious tracts, and they blanketed the country.
In 1850, the Society employed 569 traveling distributors. By boat, rail, and often on horseback, Tract Society colporteurs visited 505,422 families across the country, gave away 35 million pages of books and tracts, and sold nearly 500,000 volumes nationwide in that year alone. Christian organizations were responsible for distributing an immense quantity of religious material, yet they did not succeed in bringing about the millennium of Christ as they hoped and prayed. Nor, despite their industry, did they reach everyone. They came close, however, in the process producing the young nation's first mass medium. But trouble loomed on the horizon. In 1853, William Jay, one of the founders of the Bible and Tract movement in America, discontinued funding the American Tract Society because of its inaction on slavery. In an open letter to the Society, he expressed his painful doubts.
There is a giant, and in its influence an all-pervading sin in our land. Yet the American Tract Society has publicly and officially announced through you as its organ that it does not intend to recognize even the existence of this sin. William J.
Christian publishers, however, persevered. In 1861, the first year of the war, 370,000 more Bibles were printed than the previous year. Over the course of the war, more than 5 million Bibles were published. And while the Bible societies thrived, little, if any, Freethought activity occurred during the conflict. Free-thinking abolitionists, however, were convinced that the churches had played a central role in justifying slavery. William Lloyd Garrison called that unholy alliance between slavery and the churches the sum of all villainies. Samuel Porter Putnam, a Civil War commander, condemned the church and praised his fellow freethinkers.
It supported it, defended it, gave it the sanction of its own Bible, and persecuted and excommunicated those who were in favor of freedom. The attitude of the American church in regard to slavery has branded it with eternal shame. If freedom had been left to the tender mercies of the church, it would have perished among the clanking chains of millions. It was the infidel who kindled the fires of opposition, who stirred the people and made them see the wrong. And it is true, beyond question, that infidelity has been the salvation of American liberty. Samuel Porter Putnam.
During the Civil War, religious leaders escalated their crusade and succeeded in adding a religious motto to coins. The campaign was spearheaded by Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase, the most religious member of Lincoln's cabinet. Chase claimed responsibility for having "In God We Trust" stamped on the 2-cent coin, and took credit for Lincoln's invocation of God at the conclusion of the Emancipation Proclamation. At the height of the Civil War, Northern ministers grew concerned that the North was losing because God was angry about America's godless Constitution. Ever since the founding of the nation, Christian clergymen had grumbled about the Founding Fathers' decision not to mention God in the Constitution. In 1863, Protestant leaders resolved to do something about it and founded the National Reform Association.
A group of prominent ministers gathered from many denominations, Protestant denominations, and decided that the problem was that the state had become secular. They thought that the solution was to inscribe God and Jesus into the Constitution as the supreme authority. And so they proposed an amendment to the Constitution. They chose William Strong, a prominent leader, to be the president of their association and to introduce the amendment.
Like the ministers, Judge William Strong, who would later become an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, believed Abraham Lincoln would support their amendment since he had already ordered military commanders to observe Sunday as a day of rest, and because his powerful speeches often sounded so much like sermons. Ironically, Lincoln's best-known speech contained a biblical phrase which was also used by Thomas Paine in common sense.
Lincoln's House Divided speech sounded almost like a sermon because his text comes from Matthew 12, verse 25, which refers to a house divided or a kingdom divided itself against itself cannot stand. Lincoln knew the Bible thoroughly, particularly was fond of the Gospel of Matthew. Whether he uses this because he knows that his listeners, steeped in the Bible, largely Protestant Christians, are going to warm up to his thesis is unknown. Lincoln is a very canny politician. He's going to use ideas and concepts that will have a resonance with his audience already.
Despite his gift for biblical oratory, Abraham Lincoln did not champion the Christian Nation Amendment. Amending the Constitution should never be done hastily, Lincoln warned. The amendment failed.
After that, they turned to more secular approaches to the same ends, such as temperance, such as the crusade against obscenity.
Like most wars, the Civil War was not a good time for freedom of speech and civil liberties. Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, set the precedent for using the postal laws to regulate free speech. Blair personally confiscated mailed material that he determined was disloyal to the Union and/or might aid the Confederacy. After the war, this method would be used against social radicals, especially against free thinkers, with devastating effect. Even before the Civil War, there was a growing concern for American culture among Christian leaders who feared the popular sporting publications called the flash press, which allegedly promoted a hedonistic way of life.
The YMCA, around the time of the Civil War and after, was not the recreational association that we think of it today. It had been formed in the 1850s by a group of prominent New York businessmen who were worried about young clerks. They were hiring all sorts of young men, 14, 16, 18 years old. These men were living on their own and they were completely unsupervised. And therefore they were involved in a peer culture that was getting heavily influenced by the emergence of male sporting culture on the streets of New York.
These frightened founders of the YMCA became the leading businessmen in New York City and the leaders of a group called the Christian Commission.
The Civil War created the need for two civilian associations. One, the Sanitary Commission, is the best known, and it was a secular group that was particularly involved with bringing medical aid to the soldiers. The Christian Commission was a little different. It was a religiously oriented group. It sent ministers to the front lines of the Union troops. It sent Bibles, and it sent moral books. In the process of this, these men became aware of what was also being sent to the young man through the mails. And they then worked with the Congress of the United States to get the first obscenity law or partial law passed as a part of a post office regulation.
Near the end of a 4-year war that pitted brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, and tearing the country asunder, with more than 500,000 Americans dead and countless casualties, the members of Congress found time to address what they considered a most pressing issue of the day: obscenity. On February 8, 1865, the Senate and House passed the first bill outlawing obscenity.
After the Civil War and all the trauma of the Civil War, coupled with the rise of industrial capitalism, corruption in the U.S. government, in Congress, the presidency, there was an effort to try and ameliorate this situation by a return to purity, as Protestant fundamentalists saw it. The issue was not the inequalities of wealth and power, not the exploitation of labor, not the return to serfdom in effect by African Americans who've been freed from slavery, but now we're in Jim Crow. The idea was America could be made right if pornography could be stopped, if free thought could be stopped.
During the Civil War, Anthony Comstock, a young Union soldier stationed in Florida, began his own Christian crusade that would lead to a national censorship campaign. Comstock's life would furnish one of the most improbable examples of a rise to tyrannical power in American history.
He was unlike many of the other soldiers and therefore despised by them because he poured his rum rations onto the ground. He refused to join in the kind of gambling and play of the soldiers after hours, and attempted to work with the Christian Commission to bring moral influences to bear.
After the war, Anthony Comstock moved to New York City, where he worked in a dry goods store.
He was slightly making it, but he had a way of attaching himself to influential people. And he began a campaign against Sunday opening of saloons. He also turned to a private campaign against obscene materials on the street.
Comstock soon found kindred spirits among the leaders of the YMCA, who included some of America's most powerful men, including soap tycoon Samuel Colgate and financier J. Pierpont Morgan.
At this time, the committee that was concerned with obscene material evolved into the Society for the Suppression of Vice. And this committee and the YMCA leaders decided to work toward national legislation.
Samuel Colgate and J.P. Morgan shared a love for religion and book collecting. Yet, while Colgate owned the largest collection of Baptist books in the world, Morgan's tastes ran, amazingly, to a private collection of pornography. Still, Colgate and Morgan agreed on the importance of regulating the morality of others. These titans of industry, whom history would expose as unmitigated hypocrites, enlisted their fellow zealous Christian Anthony Comstock in their censorship campaign to lobby for repressive legislation. With blessings from New York's Christian leaders and financial support from the YMCA, Colgate and Morgan sent Comstock to Washington to set up an exhibit of seized erotic material on display for congressmen.
Essentially, the message he gave was, this is being sent to our children in boarding schools. We've got to protect our children from this evil influence going through the U.S. mails.
In 1873, a severe set of obscenity laws, known as the Comstock Laws, were passed and signed by President Ulysses S. Grant. The law's language never defined what constituted vulgar, indecent, or obscene. This determination was left up to judges, who, like most 19th century Americans, believed obscenity could be easily recognized.
It included erotica, it included implements for contraception, it included information about contraception, implements for abortion, advertisements for abortion. Therefore, was a kind of umbrella that was going to have very serious future implications that very few people understood at the time.
Anthony Comstock was appointed special agent of the United States Post Office. In a calculating political move, the self-described weeder in God's garden declined a government salary and would be funded by Christian organizations like the YMCA.
And that meant that he would not be subjected to political pressures, and he also, since it was an unsalaried position, would not be thrown out of office if a different party came into power.
The YMCA was one of the strong forces behind Comstock and the passage of stricter legislation against sexually explicit material.
Any statement challenging religion or offering information about birth control or even being politically radical could be obscene obscene and fall into Comstock's net. So Comstock pursued the Freethought movement. He pursued early advocates of birth control. He viewed all of these things as obscene.
In the post-Civil War period, abolitionists and suffragists, who believed in rationalism and separation of church and state, joined the Freethought movement. And as a counterattack to evangelical orators, liberal lecturers, inspired by Thomas Paine and armed with Darwinism to support their anti-religion ideology, crisscrossed the country, preaching the gospel of free thought to anyone who would listen. The most magnificent spokesman for the American free thought movement was Robert Green Ingersoll, a former Civil War colonel and attorney known as the Great Agnostic.
During a period when the public lecture was one of the most popular means of both instruction and entertainment, Robert Green Ingersoll was the undisputed king of the American lecture circuit. When Ingersoll came to town, whether you liked him or hated him, everyone wanted to come out and hear him.
Robert Ingersoll was arguably the greatest orator America had ever heard. Contemporaries agreed that his skill as a public speaker was unmatched. With dramatic flair, he combined the power of a lawyer's closing argument and the beauty of a Shakespearean monologue, which drew audiences who might have never given a listen to someone making a case against conventional religion.
There were some terribly nasty statements made about him. Clergy would put editorials in the paper calling the fires of hell down on him when he was coming to town, all of which was fine by Ingersoll because that would just ensure that more religious people would buy tickets to hear him speak.
Robert Ingersoll was born on August 11, 1833, in Dresden, New York, a village with the population of about 300 in New York's Finger Lakes region.
His father was a pastor who, in the 1830s, was one of the country's most outspoken abolitionists. And he was probably too far ahead of his time. Reverend Ingersoll tended not to hold the job very long.
Robert resented how his father was treated by pro-slavery congregations and dreaded Sundays, which in the Ingersoll home began on Saturday night. Every Sunday, Robert was forced to attend 2 religious services filled with hymns, prayers, and long, monotonous sermons. Following the first service and during Sunday school, he and the other children sat listening in the cold to a minister who asked them if they knew that they all deserved to go to hell, to which they all answered yes. After serving as a colonel in the Civil War, Ingersoll returned to his law practice in Peoria. In 1867, he was appointed Attorney General of Illinois, the only public office he ever held.
He served 2 years as Attorney General of Illinois. He continued to prosper in his legal practice and became extremely prominent as a lecturer and also as a campaign speech maker for the Republican Party.
Ingersoll married Eva Parker, the free-thinking daughter of a free-thinking Peoria judge. His new wife and father-in-law persuaded Ingersoll to speak out against the evils of Christianity. Beginning in 1869, Ingersoll toured the nation, giving 6 or 7 lectures a week to sold-out halls. He spoke for hours, without a microphone, in front of thousands.
Ingersoll composed his speeches in his head and then retained them in memory. He always spoke without notes. His longer speeches would go 3 or 4 hours. He had a repertoire of probably 40 addresses, which he could deliver from memory at any time.
Ingersoll's lyrical oratory covered evolutionism, literature, religion, science, women's rights, politics, and Thomas Paine.
He would routinely play the very largest theaters in large cities, mid-sized cities. He would commonly speak indoors before crowds of 3,000 or 4,000 in the big city theaters. On one occasion in Chicago, He gave a political speech before an outdoor crowd of 50,000 people. Now, I imagine only the ones who were closest actually got to hear much, but 50,000 people came out to be in the presence of Robert Ingersoll.
Robert Ingersoll was unrelenting in his attacks on traditionalist Christianity, especially its doctrine of eternal punishment, which he considered highly destructive.
Ingersoll was more angry, more morally outraged by Christianity's doctrine of eternal punishment than anything else. He thought it was just incredibly cruel that there could be a deity that would consign people to unending torment because of some mistakes they had made during a finite life. And he found that not just immoral, but outrageous. And that passion drives his oratory. He really took the idea of hell almost as a personal affront.
Mark Twain described Robert Ingersoll as an angelic orator, the evangel of a new gospel, the gospel of free thought. Robert Ingersoll would become the most important figure in free thought, second only to Thomas Paine, whom he held in high regard.
Ingersoll frequently mentioned Thomas Paine in his speeches and talked about Paine in very glowing terms. In fact, one of his stock lectures was a biographical appreciation of Paine and his importance both to the country in his service at the time of the Revolutionary War and his importance as a pamphleteer for free thought.
After the Civil War, the United States economy grew at such a rapid pace. It produced wealth never seen before in the history of the nation. It was the beginning of an era of opulence and ostentation that Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. It was also a time of stark disparity between rich and poor, a period when evolutionism, women's rights, and other political, philosophical, scientific, and social developments clashed with long-held conservative beliefs and religious orthodoxy. And in the eyes of progressive Americans, it was the dawn of a time of rationalism, when the nation stood at the threshold of a utopian future of free inquiry, free expression, and free thought.
The 19th and early 20th century freethinkers expected religion to die out very quickly. And it wasn't just them. A lot of social scientists thought the same thing. They were far too enthusiastic. We discovered in America with the fundamentalist resurgence that religion wasn't going to go away without a fight.